Good afternoon from Nairobi. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. If you could please introduce yourself in the chat box as we wait for everyone for more people to join us, that would be great. Please ensure that you include your name and affiliation so that we know who's in the room with us. Please introduce yourself in the chat box so we can know who's with us today as we wait for more people to join. As we wait, there's a video playing about our courses. Please, you can have a look at it as we wait for everyone to come in. Once we have enough quorum at 2, we will start off the forum. Thank you. Oh, thank you for letting us know. Dolo, could you please enable the chat box? Someone has just dropped a message on the Q&A section saying that the chat box is disabled. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for letting us know. We're sorting that out. Please be patient with us as we sort this issue out. Thank you. The chat box has been enabled, so you can chat in the box. Thank you so much, Dolo. Thank you. Thank you for introducing yourselves. Good to see you, Carlton. Good to see you all. Thank you so much. I think we should start. We have enough quorum. We have 62 people with us on the call as we wait for everyone to join. All right, we should go ahead and start. Thank you again for joining us at this forum today. It is both an honor and a deep responsibility to host this critical conversation on the political instability and conflict that has engulfed the region. The forum today will examine trends in security, development, governance, and regional trends in light of the unfolding crisis and their broader implications. We are truly honored to have here with us distinguished experts who have dedicated years of their lives to understanding the complexities of the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, and the Sudans. Our moderator today is Geoffrey Lugano, Education and Training Manager at the Rift Valley Institute. My name is Amina Abdul Kadir. I manage the Rift Valley Forum. The forum is a platform that is dedicated to critical exploration of important political, economic, and social issues within the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa. This session is being recorded and we are streaming live on YouTube. Please note that participants except the speakers are muted throughout the event. If you have any questions, kindly post them on the Q&A section, whose tab appears at the bottom of your screens. Without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Geoffrey Lugano to introduce the speakers and to start us off. Thank you, Geoffrey. And thank you, everyone, once again. I look forward to an interactive session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina, my colleague at the RVI. So my name is Geoffrey Lugano. As Amina said, I'm the Education and Training Manager at the RVI. And I'll be moderating the session, as Amina said. And I have a few points to note here. So first of all, we've lined 4 speakers who will cover the various regions of focus, that is the Great Lakes, Sudan, and the Horn of Africa analysis in turns, after which we will proceed to the Q&A session. The 4 of them, I'll introduce them briefly. So first we have Jason Stans, and founder of the Congo Research Group at New York University. He has spent the past 24 years researching the politics and economy of the DRC, and his latest book, one of his latest books, is The War That Doesn't Say Its Name, An Ending Conflict in the Congo, published in 2022 by Princeton University Press. Secondly, we have Raga Makawi, who is Sudanese, but also a researcher based at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. She's also an editor at African Arguments, curating political themes on the Sudans. She's also a co-author of a book titled Sudan's Unfinished Democracy, The Promise and Betrayal of a People's Revolution. Thirdly, we have Nicki Kindersley, who is a senior lecturer in African history at Cardiff University in the UK. Her research focuses on military employment, rebel governance, customary justice, and cross-border livelihoods, primarily on South Sudan. Her new book, New Sudan's Wartime Intellectual Histories in Khartoum, comes out this summer. So please look out for it. And finally, we have Ken Menkhaus, who is professor of political science at Davidson College in the US. Ken is also a senior fellow at the RVI, where he has been teaching on the Horn of African course. And his specialization is on the politics of the Horn of Africa, and has published on a range of topics, including development, conflict, peace, operations, state failure, state building, humanitarianism, and political Islam. It has authored multiple articles and books, over 100 of them. So thank you so much and welcome again. And let me hand it over to Jason Stans to begin our analysis. Thank you so much, Jason.
It appears Jason has an internet connection issue. Oh, there he is. Thank you, Jason.
Yes, can you hear me now? I'm switching back and forth between my own phone and the internet, and both of them happen to be terrible here in Addis. So can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for joining this meeting. I have 10 minutes to do what's basically going to be a quick teaser, I think, of what we intend to do with the Great Lakes course this year. I don't see the slides. I'm not sure if there we is. I think Liz is now sharing the slides. Thank you very much. Thank you. And so I'm just going to give a quick overview of what we think are some of the major trends in the region, but the Great Lakes course is going to do much more than this. We will have experts from all 4 countries talking about politics, the economy, and society. And so what I'm going to do now is give, I think, a teaser of the major developments going on, but we'll do much more during the course. Of course, the most important, I think, development in the region at the moment is an escalation of conflict. And this escalation of conflict that I think finally has hit international media in full force since the fall of Goma at the end of January is linked, it's called the M23 crisis, but it really is a regional crisis. It began as a crisis between Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and the Congo. It's very important to situate it like that. And it has the potential of reshaping the entire region. In fact, I think it very much is the goal of the M23 to reshape governance in the DRC. It's explicitly demanded for the resignation and the ouster of President Tshisekedi, as well as in Burundi. And of course, Uganda has stakes in this conflict as well. And so it's important, I think, to see this as a regional conflict that has its origins in the region and can reshape the region. Paradoxically, it began, I think, to a certain extent, with the arrival of President Tshisekedi and the integration of the DRC into the East African community. And that then created conflict between, or tensions at least, between Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And so I think this is important to understand. Of course, there are broader geopolitical considerations here as well. This is happening, that integration of Congo into the region is happening at the same time as there's a deepening of confrontation between the US and China in the region. That began during the Biden administration. I've never seen so many US government officials visit the DRC at a high level as during the Biden administration. And of course, I think will no doubt continue. It's one of the few things we can say with certainty about the Trump administration at the moment is that this is also one of the major prisms through which they see the world, the US-China confrontation. That is reverberating through the region. I don't think we know exactly how it's going to change the region, but we have now, there's now a new Great Lakes envoy that has just this week been appointed by Washington, who's very much in this mode of transactionalism that sees US foreign policy as a transactional foreign policy and that is open to trading minerals for geopolitical influence, much as in the Ukrainian case. And so we'll have to see how that shakes out in terms of the Congo and in terms of the M23 conflict. At the same time, we have the withdrawal of USAID at the very moment as you have a ramping up humanitarian crisis. There's 7 million people displaced in the DRC, roughly speaking, at the moment. It's the second largest humanitarian crisis in terms of displacement after Sudan in the world. And the US government, which provided 70% of humanitarian aid in the DRC, has cut most of that. And so you have displaced people who we can't feed anymore, nutrition for tens of thousands of children that's being cut. You have an Ebola monitoring program that's being shrunk, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to underestimate, but we're in this moment of huge flux, I think, in the region. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to, that's the large regional context. Of course, we're going to drill down deep into what's going on in the DRC, and the M23 crisis has really upended Congolese politics. I was just in Kinshasa, and politicians were telling me, we hate the M23 crisis, obviously, but if it weren't for the M23, we'd be talking about constitutional revision now. Tshisekedi had put on the table just before the fall of Goma last year the possibility of, or his desire to revise the Congolese constitution that appeared to many as a prelude to a battle over term limits in the DRC. And so that's now been put on hold and perhaps scrapped. It comes at the same time as the opposition in the DRC is polarizing. Two of the main forces in the opposition, former President Joseph Kabila as well as Moise Katumbi, are seen as close, especially Joseph Kabila, to the M23 rebellion. And you now have a distinct possibility in the future of this conflict escalating and ending in a power-sharing agreement, which of course would not only challenge the current government in Kinshasa, but could potentially challenge the constitutional order, the Third Republic that has been the constitution since 2006 in the DRC. Next slide, please. In Burundi and Rwanda, two countries that are more or less at each other's throats at the moment, where the two heads of state trade barely veiled insults and challenges. This conflict has also transformed those relations. Burundi and Rwanda have been fighting a proxy war on Congolese soil, something that is not really talked about very often, but thousands of Rwandan and Burundian soldiers have died on Congolese soil in recent years. The Burundian government has been one of the main belligerents backing up the Congolese government during the M23 crisis. And that deployment and the defeats that they have suffered in the DRC is compounding, I think, really a legitimacy, a governance, and economic crisis in Burundi that features soaring inflation, fuel and food shortages, and political turmoil, most recently evidenced by the exclusion of opposition leader Agathon Rwasa from the upcoming legislative elections in 2015. In Rwanda, the protagonist, if you will, of the M23 crisis, paradoxically seems to be, at least on the surface, the most stable of the countries in the region. Kagame won 99% of a 98% turnout vote last year, believe it or not. And so there really is no opposition, either military or political opposition, it seems to be, to his rule. But there is an increasing clash of economic models in Rwanda that I think is fascinating, which is, on the one hand, the Singapore of Africa, providing services, banking, sports and conference venues for the world. And on the other hand, this deep involvement in a war in a neighbor. And those two economic models seem to be clashing now with the suspension of suspension of aid and sanctions of senior leaders. And next slide, please. I will finish off with Uganda, and hope I haven't taken too much of the 10 minutes that were allotted to me. Uganda as well is deeply involved in this crisis, this M23 crisis, in a very ambiguous way. It's got one foot on either side of the crisis, if you will. It has been reported and documented to be in collaboration with the M23, and yet it still continues to collaborate in joint operations with the Congolese army. And to a certain extent, that I think is a manifestation of tensions within the NRM and the UPDF, the Ugandan ruling party and army. And that is worrisome, in part because this gentleman here on the screen, Yoweri Museveni, who's now 80 years old and has been in power for 4 decades, is not like all of us, immortal, and will at some point have to hand over power. And that, even though it's still on the horizon, hard to say how far horizon or how distant horizon that is, really could fracture the political system in Uganda, but also stability. But at the same time, there are rising economic hopes for Uganda that come with the oil that is supposed to start being exported this year and next year. So as you can see, it's a region that is fascinating, deeply in flux, with enormous potential, but also in a deep crisis at the moment. And we look forward to exploring all of these issues with you in the Great Lakes course. So with that, I'll hand over back to Jeffrey, and I look forward to engaging with your questions.
Thank you so much, Jason, for those deep insights. So let me welcome on board Raja from the Sudans. Raja.
Hi. Can you guys see me and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason, for that really informative start to this event. I'm going to talk briefly about how Sudan kind of fits into this larger, puzzle crisis of the Horn. And it does share some features of what's happening in the Great Lakes, and possibly with other areas as well. I'm going to focus on Sudan's post-Bashir transition period, which is a microscope of the country's many historical crises, which are in themselves an intermesh of failed external interventions and internal violent dynamics, which are out of harmony with local realities. I'll try and outline very briefly 5 of the most salient at the current juncture. Obviously, with the war in Sudan, everything that's happening, it's impossible to cover all of it. even though myself and Nicki have designed a Sudan's course that kind of, looks at the long durée of conflict in the Sudan and how it's come to shape its polity, the polity of both countries. So the first point is on peacemaking. Now, peacemaking here in this particular case after the war was attempted as a means to end the conflict, which wasn't very successful, if you recall, through platforms like Jeddah. But then if you go back a little bit to 2019, just after the fall of al-Bashir, peacemaking was a tool of political reconfiguration of Sudan's central polity. So it was an attempt to bring in Darfur rebels into the fold of government and end conflict in that way. And so peacemaking, unfortunately, continues in times of peace and war, continue to enable the creation of an armed political class, while promoting a central role for the army in governance. The period between 2019 and 2020, which was supposedly one of civic transition, was an all-time low phase of state building. And rather, we saw clear instances of state unmaking, even by civic actors in power. And it was peacemaking or peace building that kind of enabled that. Now, the second point is the growth of a parallel shadow economy run through illicit activities and enabled by the rising violence in politics. Now, one reason for that is the demonopolization of violence away from the state, which allowed for the emergence of alternative authorities, which were enabled and emboldened to extract resources and taxes without necessarily liaising with the state to manage what are essentially public revenues. So we saw the presence of the RSF in different places in Darfur, managing the extraction of gold, managing the flow of livestock, and then eventually the same kind of militia form that predominated in Darfur move closer and closer to the center, and at some point it was operating both its military and economic, kind of parallel bureaucracy on behalf of the state in the near periphery. So even in places like Al Jazeera, in the Jazeera scheme, they've stepped in on behalf of the state or instead of the state to manage labor, agricultural labor, and other things as well. And now, unfortunately, this has not ended with the onset of the war. So we see that, for example, in Khartoum, which was a territory completely under the control of RSF until recently, a predatory form of political economy that was devised by the RSF first in Darfur and later on in Al-Butana, in the hinterland in Sudan, being very, successfully used to manage uncontrolled Khartoum. So Khartoum kind of, featured as a predominant kind of economic center for the RSF, and it was one of the main reasons they were able to hold on to it for very long. So kind of, as we transition out of this war, God knows towards where, we're going to see the continued presence of an illicit form of economic management of public state resources. Now, the third point that we need to look out for is the fragmentation of the Sudanese polity. And this fragmentation is happening along regional and ethnic lines in a way that goes beyond the political map that we once understood and that we could clearly identify ideological centers of contestations in. The ongoing war, unfortunately, is exacerbating this fragmentation even further, as the polarizing discourse of us versus them pits communities against each other. So to use Joshua Craze's eloquent phrase, he talks about the transposition of a political war onto an ethnic one. This is what's happening in Sudan right now. But instead of it being just, Khartoum versus Darfur, it's everywhere against everyone. Now, the problem with this particular issue is that post-war reconstruction is impossible in the context of such a severe fragmentation. And worse still, our limited understanding of how it works and along which lines it's constantly being redrawn limits any form of intervention, whether it was developmental or humanitarian. How can we plan a way out of the war if we don't understand the risk triggers in order to be able to plan an adequate response? The fifth point and the last point is the rise of new non-state actors, which is also a major development in Sudan post-Bashir. Despite the problems associated with some of those state actors, the militia being one, the rise of these non-state actors was a real moment of political liberalization, more so than the CPA years, despite claims of the contrary. Obviously, the most evident of, as I said, these non-state actors is the RSF, which has been, locked in a conflict with SAF, rivaling it over this control of the state. However, another form of non-state actor, another type of non-state actor is at the level of civil society, is the growth of organic grassroots bodies. So one example, obviously, is the resisting committees. Now, the resisting committees are important because they provide a political agenda and a project that has pushed, the idea of change beyond, the standard concept of a civic transition or good governance in the traditional way. And their importance as effective state actors continues to play a huge role, or continues to demonstrate itself as important, as necessary as we move forward in this current war period. I mean, mutual aid groups that grew out of the resisting committees are perhaps the first and only on the ground first responders, providing all sorts of humanitarian intervention and community support in the absence of the international community as well as the state. Now, an important point to make about the resistant committees back in the period between 2019 and 2023, until the war kind of erupted, and their current predecessors, which are the mutual aid groups. What's really interesting about them is that they are engaged in a process of state building, like a serious one. In this current, obviously, there are so many examples that we intend to touch upon in the course, but in this particular junction during the war, just one example of how they're engaged in state building is that they are resisting the polarizing war discourse through community-based responses, and they're holding belligerents accountable to the atrocities they're committing, while also adapting their political discourse to the developments of the day. And these are huge, political actions and activities in the context of war. This is not a small feat that they're engaged in. And most importantly, and this is based on some recent research me and a Sudanese colleague are engaged in, that they're invested, these mutual aid groups at the level of the community, they're invested in self-help mechanisms in order to build resilience against conflict. And they're doing this by setting up micro-industry in areas cut off from global markets. So survivalism in the context of Sudan, as done by these groups, is developmentalist in its approach. So again, many moments of disintegration, but also there are features of state building. The question is now, how can, we as Sudanese, whether, in the near diaspora or the far diaspora or on the ground, international community or others who are involved, who are interested in Sudan, the question is how we capitalize on state building, on these, features of state building to ensure advocate intervention as we move forward. I'm just going to stop here and hand it over to Nicki. Thank you.
Thank you, Raga. I will follow up with a few points from South Sudan as the connection basically along the Niles across this conversation. And I have two dominant concerns I would want to raise about the situation in South Sudan. The first, of course, being the potential immediate collapse of the Transitional Government of National Unity here in Juba, which has been in transition since 2018 very successfully. This is a peacemaking project, as Raja has just noted, that has allowed President Salva Kiir to wipe out significant factions of his opposition and their economic bases, while also maintaining space for the systemic privatization and profit at the center of the state here. And with the fall of Nasser to the White Army not long ago, last week, there is a potential for the reassertion of a much more direct military command instead of this government of national unity by President Kiir in potentially a new wave of elimination campaigns against the White Army opposition and whatever constitutes now the IO, especially in Nasser. We're waiting to see where the front lines are being formed here. The other key question in play, much like we see southwards in Uganda, is the question of political succession after Kiir. Either way, if the Transitional Government of National Unity survives or not over the next month, the big question is the methods of smooth transition and what transition looks like in the near future. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about the future of elections. And this is something that a recent Rift Valley Institute report, a research report from South Sudan has talked about in detail, and something we definitely pick up on in the course. But actually, I just wanted to highlight where the dynamics that we should be watching actually are. And I think these dynamics to watch are actually at the borders, not here in Juba. And fundamentally, these are connected to two things. Firstly, of course, the war in Sudan as this interconnected political economy, but also the commercial investments of the privatized state here in South Sudan. So firstly, thinking about the borders and the Sudan war, if the rapid support forces do create what looks like a possibility of a real borderland monopoly along the entire corridor of the Sudan and South Sudan borders and circling round through into Western Bahr el Ghazal's new mining spaces around Raga, where they are already operational, this will put both the Sudan Armed Forces and Kiir's governments under real political pressure, if not already. And the risk is that the rapid support forces will be able to extend their forms of extractive self-resourcing along this incredibly useful space, most obviously controlling oil pipelines, but of course extending commercial enterprises across what is an extremely lucrative set of natural resource territories. And I mean, we can see this with the rapid support forces moving into Western Bahr el Ghazal, looking at the mining routes and the opening up of new mining speculations across that region, including into Northern Bahr el Ghazal. And we can see this kind of similar ceding of territorial grounds from the south as well. So with Uganda and the UPDF now already annexing bits of the borderland of South Sudan, particularly at Kajo-Keji, under similar grounds, really interestingly. And this shifting border has not necessarily been commented on if you focus primarily on the politics from the center of the state. UPDF is now, of course, in the last week, fortifying Juba, I quote, as if it was their own country, which is very handy, under this operation called Silent Guardian. So there's tensions here over kind of not just borderlands, but over who gets protected by whom in the region. And the second dynamic I wanted to highlight is that we need to be watching very closely these securitized private commercial fiefdoms, I would say, that are springing up across the very large territory of southern Sudan. These constitute extensive privatization, basically, both of state wealth, but also the corporatization of resource extraction by state actors. We can see this most particularly in across its borderlands with Kenya. We can also be looking at Raga and these new mines opening up around northern Baragazal and the extractive economies across the borderlands into southern Darfur with the RSF. We should be very carefully looking at this developmentalist kind of regionalization, commercialization that proceeds essentially on a licensing basis from Juba, as the state has retrenched with less oil wealth to disperse, and it's now selling essentially the licenses to produce this developmental commercialization. We should be looking at the licensing of water, of small dam project causing absolute chaos across the Equatorias, but are incredibly lucrative, and land leasing, which is proceeding, it appears, on a much more rigorous basis, like back to the kind of global land grab eras of the late 2000s. Some of this is involved in kind of the two competing models of developmentalism, both kind of commercial like resource extraction, very anti-climate change sensitive, and then the somewhat more interesting attempts to privatize and commodify land and space and biodiversity in conservation projects. There's two competing forms of developmentalism going on at the moment from South Sudan. And just a final note that this competition for territorial control over these forms of regional commercialization and licensing of state monopolies is creating and creating real foment for real ethno-nationalist political projects. Right? This is where the kind of unspoken civil society organization is really happening. You can see this particularly in Western Equatoria over competition, over state control and regional control in that state. So these are the key dynamics I would watch. And I do feel like they fit particularly into this like wider ecosystem, and something that I really hope we can discuss this summer on the courses. All right, I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you, Nicki. Let me bring on board Ken.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Do we have my PowerPoint slide? All right. Thank you all for joining us. I've got 10 points in 10 minutes that I'd like to quickly discuss. All of these we'll do a deep dive on in the Horn of Africa course this summer. The first observation is that the Horn of Africa remains a site of enduring very complex intrastate armed conflicts. They are baffling in their complexity. We've got government versus non-state actors. In Ethiopia, we've also got paramilitaries versus paramilitaries of ethnic origin, and then we've got communal clashes there. In Somalia, we've got the government fighting al-Shabaab. We've got the government fighting, in one case, a federal member state, Jubaland, this past year, even though the two of them are supposed to be in the same government and they're getting funding to fight al-Shabaab, but they ended up fighting one another. And then communal clashes in Somalia as well as multiple separatist movements of groups that are trying to extract themselves from a federal member state to which they don't want to belong. This is producing an enormous amount of pressure on government security sector, both in Ethiopia and in Somalia. The weakness of the security sector in the case of Ethiopia, because of its preoccupation with some of the battles that it is having to fight in northern Ethiopia, has meant that some of the borderlands have gone less well protected, and that is producing a rise both in Somalia and in Ethiopia for different reasons of more local protection forces. Most notably in Somalia over the past couple of years, the rise of the so-called Maoisli. These are clan militias that have fought against al-Shabaab in response to what they see as oppressive forced conscription and taxation, and that has actually posed an interesting challenge to the Somali government, because on the one hand, they're happy that they've got an ally, local allies against al-Shabaab. On the other hand, these are forces that they don't have direct control over, and they worry could become politicized at their expense. In Somalia, all of this security concerns are compounded by a couple of relatively new developments. One is the transition of the African Union peacekeeping forces, and big questions about who will be the troop contributing countries. Will Ethiopia be able to remain in southern Somalia? That appears to be resolved recently. Who will pay for this? And then the breaking news of U.S. Foreign policy shifts that could dramatically reduce the amount of security support that Somalia's special forces and army have been receiving from the U.S. government. The second trend is tense regional relations. Here we've seen over the past year a slight improvement thanks to Ethiopia and Somalia pulling back from the brink of a disastrous 2024, where tensions reached very high levels over Ethiopia's memo of understanding with the unrecognized secessionist state of Somaliland for access to a seaport and the potential development of a naval base there. That was an international crisis. Both governments have backed off a little bit. That's not entirely resolved though, so it's simmering. It could get worse again, but that was relatively good news. More broadly though, we still have lots and lots of regional tensions, the most dangerous of which remains the possibility of armed conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, as Eritrea's forces remain in portions of northern Ethiopia. Endemic border disputes across the region, both within countries and between them, are very, very serious. We're seeing in Ethiopia some of the legacy of unresolved ethno-federalism, where some of the borders were never really finalized between the ethno-federal states. And those are really heating up now in the context of the instability in Somalia, in places like Afar and Somali regional state, and Oromia. And of course, the most dramatic is the competing tensions over the border in Tigray between the Amhara state and the Tigray state. But in Somalia, we've got the same. The biggest is in the north, with the contested border between Somaliland and Puntland. Puntland claiming some territory there, Somaliland claiming the same territory, and then the local population claiming that they would like to be their own separate federal member state, the Solsanag Ain Katuma state, and that has produced armed clashes there as well. Political fragmentation is the fourth trend that we'll spend some time in the course looking at. Everywhere across the region, the political settlements that have been kind of the glue keeping polities together are increasingly challenged and eroded. The fragmentation in Ethiopia includes disputes not just between ethnic paramilitaries and the central government, but within some of these ethno-federal states and their movements. Divide and rule tactics by the Ethiopian government have only exacerbated that. In Somalia, we've seen the rise of the proliferation of district councils as a means of political patronage to keep clans happy and in the fold. We've seen 2 federal member states in Somalia suspend relations with the government. So both Puntland and Jubaland now are not currently part of the federal government, and that's really that's a very serious development there. The next trend that we'll certainly spend time on in the course is the evolving jihadi threat. Now, al-Shabaab has been a jihadi terrorist threat in Somalia and the wider region for 20 years. It is one of the most enduring and dangerous groups in Africa. We've seen a couple of interesting trends over the past year or two. One is al-Shabaab taking advantage of the turbulence in Ethiopia to expand a presence in the Bole Mountains in southern Ethiopia. And now more recently, we've seen ISIS establishing a major foothold in northeast Somalia in Puntland. And this is a mostly international group. This is not composed primarily of Somalis. These are jihadis from other parts of the world, and that's attracted a lot of attention from other states in the region. Rising role of regional states. This has been a long-running trend in the Horn of Africa. We've seen it this past year with Turkey's mediating role between Ethiopia and Somalia, but we've also seen, Turkey, UAE, Saudi Arabia, others increasingly asserting their interests, playing sometimes constructive roles, sometimes playing out proxy wars in the region, and that is a trend that we think will endure. Over the past year, the big new trend was Egypt becoming much more involved in military support in Somalia in response to the MOU and its long-term rivalry with Ethiopia. Water politics is actually the theme of our course, turbulent waters, both inland waters and the Red Sea waters have become sources of intense competition. Red Sea politics has been fascinating to watch as external actors scramble for access to seaports. The ongoing disputes over control of the Nile, hydropolitics of the Nile between Ethiopia and Egypt remain. But there are other rivers that emanate from the water tower that is Ethiopia, flowing into Kenya and Somalia. And the control of that water flow is of enormous existential importance, really, for Somalia, because it feeds into the breadbasket of southern Somalia, and the dispensation of those waters remains unresolved in the region. One trend that we'll look at, it's not really a trend, it's more breaking news, and my colleagues have already referred to this in in Sudan, South Sudan, and the Great Lakes, is the likely impact of the dramatic about-face of U.S. foreign policy, particularly U.S. aid. Both Ethiopia and Somalia are heavily dependent on U.S. aid, $1.2 billion for Ethiopia. Somalia's federal budget is 70% covered by foreign aid. And as we see other countries like the UK announce that they're shifting some of their development aid toward support for military support for Ukraine, we could be looking at some really, really serious ramifications for these two countries. So we'll be looking at that very closely. Finally, economic stresses and humanitarian needs. Ethiopia and Somalia are two of the poorest countries in the world. Ethiopia has been battling very high inflation. The good news is it's come down somewhat. The bad news is the cost of living is still extremely onerous for Ethiopians, and they're under a lot of stress. Across both countries, we're seeing growing wealth inequalities that are potentially really worrisome. Somalia has had some good news economically in that it's gotten debt relief in the form of HIPC, and that's great news. But both countries are looking at ongoing chronic humanitarian crises. Ethiopia has 1.9 million IDPs alone. Somalia has long had a very, very large IDP population, 400,000 just in Mogadishu itself. And how those humanitarian needs will be met in a context of declining external aid remains to be seen. Let me end with on a positive note, and that is Somalia did produce some really good news this year, specifically the unrecognized secessionist state of Somaliland in the northwest held elections. And we were worried about them for some time, but they turned out great. They were peaceful. They were one person, one vote elections. They produced a peaceful transfer of power, and that is great news and a real model for the rest of Somalia. Puntland nearby has also successfully engaged in direct elections at the district council level. So that's, again, showing that this can be done in certain circumstances where security and politics permit. However, down in south central Somalia, the debate rages on over the appropriateness and the feasibility and the politics of a shift to one person, one vote there, first at the local level and then eventually at national elections. Thanks so much. We're looking forward to talking about all of this in the course.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken, for that insightful analysis of the Horn of Africa. So I have questions here directed to all our panelists. I'll begin with questions to Jason. A number of them, some of them in French, but I'll translate. I think I have some translations here. Yeah, so first three questions, Jason, from Delphine from UNICEF. The first question is, what is your assessment regarding the likelihood of the conflict in Eastern DRC expanding into Burundi? In particular, she asks whether Rwanda has any interest in direct confrontation on Burundian soil, and how the ongoing stability in the DRC risks exacerbating Burundi's internal vulnerabilities, particularly its economic and political fragility. That's one question. Second is, M23 and DRC government are said to be having direct talks in Angola, according to reports coming from Kinshasa. What is your take on the talks changing the situation on the ground beyond the political talks? And the last question that I will read is, could you share with us your analysis regarding the interests Rwanda is following in Eastern DRC, as well as the objectives it hopes to achieve through the reactivation of the M23?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeffrey. We could speak a long time about these. I'll try to be short. Is there another round of questions after this, Jeffrey? Or is that, we'll see how much time I have, I guess. Okay. With regards to Burundi, I mean, really the conflict with the M23 has its roots in Burundi as well. If you go back to 2021, and you see that, if you look at the reasons, at least that myself and I think others understand Rwanda to start backing the M23, it had to do with the UPDF, the Ugandan army, deploying troops into the northeastern DRC in the Operation Shuja. At the same time, you had Burundi deploying troops into South Kivu province. And it was this encirclement of Rwanda, really, this isolation of Rwanda. There's economic isolation as well. If you look at some of the infrastructure projects in the region, that Rwanda felt increasingly isolated. So Burundi from the beginning was one of the reasons that Rwanda deployed its army into the eastern DRC. Burundi then stepped up in a really massive way. I mean, there's estimates of 10 to 14,000 Burundian troops in the DRC. And so Burundi really was involved. And I think at a certain point, Rwanda saw, if you look at the way the conflict developed with the M23, Rwanda saw pushing back against the Burundian government and potentially destabilizing the Burundian government as part of its strategic objectives. I think because of the defeat of the Congolese army and the Burundian troops on the ground throughout their progress up to Goma and then down to Bukavu, the Burundian government has really had to reassess its involvement in the DRC. They continue to be there, but about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there were talks between the Rwandan and the Burundian authorities, relatively under wraps. And you saw after that the M23 stop its progression towards Uvira town, which they could have probably pretty easily taken, and continue to expand elsewhere, including to go towards Walikale, which is what they've now entered, as well as into the high plateau of South Kivu, where they're trying to link up with the Twirwaneho armed groups, the Banyamulenga armed groups. And I think that's really telling, because if the M23 had taken Uvira, then it would have further asphyxiated Burundi. Burundi's already under enormous strain. They get fuel through Uvira. They get especially a lot of hard currency through Uvira. So I think that's important. So I do think that they have had objectives in Burundi. It seems to be tamped down a little bit, but it's in the war of words has not necessarily stopped, although Kagame seems to be mostly focused on Tshisekedi. The second question, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was about the talks in Luanda that have been announced. I think that the Congolese government has realized that it has no choice, but I mean, it's for a long time, including up into the Luanda agreement of last year. There was almost an agreement on Luanda last year between Rwanda and the Congo. And it was scuppered at the last minute because Rwanda insisted that the Congolese speak directly with the M23, something the Congo had refused to do until now. Now, I think that they have now conceded that's in private, they say we will do that. In public, they're trying to finesse it to not make it seem like they're going back on something they committed not to do. But I think they have to do it. I think, unfortunately, my analysis is that even if the Congolese enter into direct negotiations with the M23, the conflict will probably escalate and continue in the east. And that's because based on what the M23 holds at the moment, Goma and Bukavu, these are large towns, but I don't think they'll be able to, that's enough leverage for them to be able to attain their objectives. Their objectives are, I think, if you believe them, at the very least, power sharing in Kinshasa, and probably also forcing Tshisekedi to resign. Tshisekedi's not going to resign based on the M23 holding Goma and Bukavu. They need more leverage, and so therefore I think they're going to keep on expanding, which we currently see them doing. It looks like they're heading into Walikale territory, which could take them eventually towards Kisangani and southwards towards Kalemi. I think those are the two probably next big strategic objectives. Then finally, the question on Rwanda's objectives is a very long and complicated, and I think the honest answer is we don't really know what Rwanda's objectives are yet. But I think taking a step back, if you look at 30 years of conflict in the DRC, the conflict started in the DRC, or the prelude to the conflict started in 1993. If you look back, it is clear that all three neighboring countries, Rwanda, especially Rwanda and Uganda, have strategic objectives in the Eastern DRC. They consider projecting power and influence into the Eastern DRC as important and as a priority. Now, they do so in very different ways, Uganda and Rwanda. But Rwanda has now backed 5 different rebellions in the Eastern DRC. And I think that regardless of what and I think they have various objectives. There's a security component. There's obviously an economic component. They exported last year over $1 billion in minerals, much of which is from the Eastern DRC. There is increasingly a discourse of Greater Rwanda that's being vehiculated especially towards the Rwandan audience in a public. And so I think that if you take all these things together, it's very clear that they consider their strategic objective is to have the Eastern DRC as be under their influence. How exactly that manifests itself, whether this is through disorganization and chaos, whether this is through a proxy government there, whether this is through a power sharing agreement, that can vary and that can change. And I very much think it's in flux. I think that the strategic objective is large. The manifestation of that, I think, can take different shapes and forms. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. One final question from someone here is that, okay, it says, hello, Jason, happy to hear from you. What are your thoughts on international sanctions against Rwanda? Are they smoke and mirrors, or are they enough to pressure to force the government to give in? I did a French translation.
Well, I mean, you can look at that in 2 different ways. You can look at that as the material sanctions, the actual amount that's been sanctioned. It's not very much. I mean, Rwanda received, I think, 2023, $1.3 billion in humanitarian and development aid. Of the current sanctions, probably affect maybe 5 to 10% of that. So not very much, I would say. I don't think Rwanda is bothered too much by the actual amount of the sanctions. The big chunk of money is multilateral. It's the World Bank, it's the EU, it's the IMF. And those, I think, are not going to be touched. The EU, there are member states in the EU that are reluctant to do that, and this kind of policy in the EU requires consensus. The World Bank and the IMF there's been pressure within both of those institutions, but I think at the moment they're not there yet. But another way to look at this is symbolism. I mean, the most important export that Rwanda has is its reputation. It's brand Rwanda, as they call it. And so if you look at that, some shine has come off that reputation. I always tell people who ask me this question that I think that the canary in the gold mine is probably Arsenal jerseys. If Arsenal and PSG, if they take Visit Rwanda off their jerseys, or Bayern Munich takes Visit Rwanda off their stadium advertising, I think that's almost a much bigger message sent to Rwanda. The fact that John Legend had a concert in Kigali and Thames didn't, these things I think are almost more important to Rwanda than the actual material sanctions imposed on them.
Thank you so much, Jason. And we cannot excuse you if you want to leave, because I know you're pressed for time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So our audience, please kindly note that Jason is leaving for another assignment. So I have another set of questions from the audience. The first one is from Michael Odhiambo. I'll read them just randomly because they are all directed to our different panelists. So first one is Michael Odhiambo. I think he's now in Juba. So he says, I'm currently in Juba, where yesterday the DRC Minister for International Cooperation was in town to reportedly learn from the experience of South Sudan in managing conflict. He puts it in quotes. In the past, the parties in the ongoing Sudan war have visited Juba to seek the country's intervention and support. Can the panelists, this is directed to all of you, the 3 of you, speak to link, if any, between the situation in South Sudan, which is a near permanent transition, and the conflict reality in both the region? That's the first question from Michael, directed to all of you, the kind of linkages between this permanent transition and the conflict reality in the region. Then secondly, Margaret Gishanga directs the question to Raga. What do you make of the resistance committee's capacity to embed a local level legitimacy for the post-conflict period as a new kind of network state actor that will be able to transcend class, religion, and ethnic divisions? Then another question to Raga. I'm a victim of Sudan's civil war and an anonymous attendee in South Kordofan Mountains. I'm curious to know what you think constitutes Sudanese internal wars and conflicts. And then another anonymous attendee, dear Ken, could you share more on how Fano militias are contesting control of the Amhara region in terms of governance functions? Another to Ken, can you predict what will happen between Ethiopia and Eritrea as tensions continue between the two countries and internally within Tigray? And the last question that I'm reading from this round is to Nicki. Can you share some thoughts on how Juba will continue to balance between RSF and SAF, especially in the context of growing UAE influence and demand in South Sudan? Yes, I think we can take those rounds of questions. Yeah. Maybe let me start with Raja, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So maybe just to first respond to the question about listing committees kind of shaping the future of post-conflict in a legitimate way. Yes, absolutely. And obviously this is not a product of the war itself, but a continuation of efforts that were a byproduct of Bashir's fall, but also shaped by the transition. So whatever, legitimacy project that the post-Bashir period espoused as developed by these grassroots bodies continues still in some shape and form in the war context. But having said that, I mean, obviously, it takes on many shapes and forms. Perhaps the most salient is the fact that they are first responders at the level of the community. And there are studies that suggest that, war because of the level of, violence and disintegration provides a context in which kind of, real reconfiguration of social and economic relations can happen. And I think this is happening in Sudan now, with the resistant committees being at the heart of this process. But having said that, it is also important to realize that resistant committees are, Sudanese individuals who have their own particular histories and, are part of this kind of contentious, structure that is not agentless and whose politics is not flat. I mean, obviously, more of them do have opinions about this war, and they have their own positionalities, and they've taken positions and supported them somehow. One huge example is the fact that there is a standing contingent within the popular forces that are attached to the Sudanese army, and they actually call themselves that, Popular Armed Contingent of, SAF forces fighting against the RSF alongside SAF. And they've published statements stating or suggesting that they have decided to take up weapons and join the war front because they believe in, a set of issues have actually kind of mobilized them in this direction. So again, they're not active bystanders. They're not bystanders, they're active political agents in the current process. And that has, that comes with its own set of consequences. It's not 2019 anymore, where the Sudanese public was, merely involved in mass political mobilizations through protests and strikes. The entirety of the Sudanese polity has shifted into an active conflict situation, and this comes with, you know, its own implications. So kind of just trying to always balance these realities when we talk about post-conflict and legitimacy is necessary, so we don't come out with some sort of flat analysis of us versus them, or the good versus the bad, and yeah. The question about what constitutes internal conflicts. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on what you meant? So what was the third question, Geoffrey?
Yeah, there's a third question is on let me just get it. Yeah, there's a victim of Sudan civil war in South Kordofan, Nuba Mountains. Is curious, or she's curious to know, what do you think constitutes Sudanese internal wars and conflicts?
Yeah, I just asked them back if they could just clarify with another question, because it's a bit too broad, the question itself.
Yeah.
Do you want
so
standard
academic
definition of what internal conflicts are? Could you? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I hope they'll clarify. So we can move to the next panelist, Nicki.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. I'm trying to keep up. So just on the permanent transition in South Sudan and conflict realities. So the agility, the use of delay in all politics, right, it's a common tactic, but South Sudan is really a leading strategist with this tactic. There have been 2 years total of non-transitional government in South Sudan since 2005. And people joke here that the government needs about 3 or 4 new transitional periods and election extensions to get the agreement done at this rate. So I think there's this combination of cyclical peace brokerage, election postponements that we're seeing across Africa, right, in the last couple of years, and these wars of position are all ways of mediating their structures and networks of control within autocracy, rather than the old method of kind of rubber stamping yourself through elections. What happens when you can't afford a big tent politics is the question currently in South Sudan. So there's a new type of delay politics that needs to be worked out. And at the moment, the answer to that is that you license self-funding and self-production of your agents in exchange for them doing your political and military projects, which is what I was kind of pointing to around this commercialization stuff. So we need to think about what we mean when Ken is talking about fragmentation and the rise of regional states, maybe within these methods of supposed peace agreement maintenance. This links to, I'm just going to pull a question out of the chat from Jutta about the question around the Tumaini peace talks in Nairobi about the South Sudan kind of politics and leverage of the international communities and religious leaders, if I'm passing that right. I would turn back to Jutta and say, like, what is there left to mediate here? I mean, Tumaini was an attempt to reformulate the revitalized agreements into a kind of, from a transitional kind of détente into a new financial outlook in some respects, to rebalance on a new budget. But with the capture of Nasser last week, like with Nasser's capture, it really depends if Kiir's government feels that it needs to be investing in this rebalancing currently. Tumaini was a really useful delay process for a couple of years, right? But it may not be quite needed anymore, or it might be put on hold for a little bit. And this means, you know, the question is, where is the leverage here? And I would turn this back to governments, like that especially since aid money is being cut so drastically, both in the UK and the US, particularly, governments are cutting off their major source of leverage, which is their identity as donors. So I'm not entirely certain what leverage they're talking about if they're not talking about that. And then the final question on like how Juba's continuing to balance between RSF and SAF and its regional diplomacy, especially with UAE influence and particularly money. So we saw that January 2025 agreement between the UAE and South Sudan for control over South Sudan's oil for the next 20 years, starting this year. And we see that kind of on the back of the withdrawal of China and all of these kind of other consortium members control in South Sudanese oil last year. And this comes with promises of the old Lamu pipeline again. So the idea is reinvigorated. But ultimately, I mean, I am not a kind of high politics person particularly, but my understanding of this personally is that if the Rapid Support Force, if this new RSF government manage this entire borderland and assert a government with Al-Hilou in the Nuba Mountains, using this new Sudan marginalization rhetoric, which is slightly baffling, really, when you look at what the RSF is, but is current and was used in the launch of their government. It would be very surprising to me if Kiir could maintain very cordial relationships with Burhan's government, and also financially, whether that would be of any direct benefit. The RSF controls these lucrative borderlands. It controls the pipeline at the spigot. It also potentially controls these ties to UAE, or is very significantly influential over them. So I'm quite, as you can tell, slightly pessimistic about whether this three-way relationship can be maintained, that Kiir has been balancing quite carefully for the last year at least. I'll leave it there, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nicki. Finally, Ken?
If I could just step back and share with our participants, you know, a broader observation as we listen to these different presentations across the region, one of the things that really jumps out is the extraordinary complexity of politics on the ground. We've got states, we've got quasi-states, we've got non-state actors, all jostling and competing for control over very complex political economies in the region. This makes for really, really challenging environment, both for the local populations, just to try to figure out how they get to market, if they can get their kids to school, how to make a living, and for external actors, donor agencies, and nonprofits trying to operate in this environment. If I could, I know we're over time, so I'll just focus on the one question that was asked of me about regional relations in the Horn. There are two frames for understanding regional relations in the Horn. The one is geostrategic, and it's been the dominant frame both for policy action and for our understanding of the Horn for a long time. And it's currently back in play now. And that is to say, the point of departure is Ethiopia is the regional hegemon and attempts to exercise its regional hegemony in part by ensuring that there are pliant smaller satellite states in the region, and then those smaller states in the region pushing back and doing everything they can to try to erode Ethiopia's influence and undercut them. That's where we're at now. Again, there was an interruption of this, thanks to the tripartite agreement in 2018 through 2021 between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. And Egypt is exploiting this return to the geostrategic rivalries in the region by providing support to Somalia and Eritrea. I think that's likely to endure. That is the bad news about that, is that produces a lot of proxy wars in the region, a lot of attempts to exploit one another's internal divisions, of which there are many. But there is that second framing that was dominant for just a short period of time during the tripartite agreement, and that is viewing the Horn of Africa in terms of economic integration and the prospects and possibilities for economic development if you've got all of the regional actors working together, promoting trade, promoting investment. It's win-win. Ethiopia gets access to multiple seaports. The seaports benefit from accessing the world's largest domestic market without a seaport. It remains to be seen whose vision will prevail on that. The more optimistic one is the economic integration, but right now we are definitely in a period of intense geostrategic rivalries that tend to produce and magnify the destabilizing effects of armed conflict everywhere. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. One final question to Ken. What's your take on the tripartite? Not really this one. There's a question that I think has not been answered, because that one I think has been conclusively answered. There is one particular question on whether, let me get it, it kind of disappeared because there's so many questions on the chat.
Well, if we can't find it, know that we've got experts on the Horn of Africa course who will be handling that this summer for sure.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, to what extent can the donors' dwindling funding balance the power, balance
Yes.
the power relations between traditional and non-traditional donors, and how will this affect set building in the Horn of Africa region? I think that's my last question to you.
Yeah, okay. I think that the straightforward answer there is the declining support from traditional donors is going to be at least partially filled by the new actors or non-traditional donors, whatever we want to call them. They're not that new anymore. They've been around in the region for a long time, so we need to come up with a better name for them. But the UAEs, the Saudis, the Turks, and others, and certainly China. China is already the largest trade partner for both Ethiopia and Somalia by a country mile. Yes, they will certainly step in. Their roles will be magnified. Whether they will be able to fill the vacuum entirely by the declining or the loss of aid from key Western states remains to be seen. The key is all of these new actors, they have their agendas. They have agendas about control and management of seaports and access to minerals, and so they won't be a panacea. They'll just change the game in some interesting ways.
Thank you so much, Ken. So that marks the end of our session. So let me just thank you all for showing up, and we regret that we've gone over beyond our time with around 11 minutes, and I think that's because we have so many questions because of the kind of interest that you had in the analysis that we had. So first of all, thank you so much to our presenters for the wonderful insights we got from you, and to our participants also, thank you so much for finding time to attend today's forum. So I am acknowledging that many of the questions that you asked have not been conclusively addressed, and some of these insights will be further explored in the different courses we've lined up for you. So on the 26th, between the 26th to the 29th of May, we have the Horn of Africa course, which Ken, who has been our speaker here on the Horn of Africa, will direct. Then the Great Lakes course is lined up for between 2nd of June through 5th of June, co-directed by Raga Makawi, who just spoke, together with Nicki, Kindersley. And finally, the Sudan course will be directed by Jason Stans, and it will be held between the 9th and 12th of June. So we do welcome you to visit our website. The information is there on the screen. You can also write to myself, Geoffrey Lugano, or Zainabu Boke. Our emails are available on our platform, their web platform, and we hope to see many of you signing up for the courses. So thank you so much, and hope to see you soon.